After Enlightenment ideas emerged in the late 18th century in Europe, um, ideas such as nationalism and self-autonomy kept going throughout the entirety of Europe, which led to the 19th century being known as the Age of Revolution, at least the first half of it, with revolutions happening in 1830, 1848, and even the later half-century unification movements, which have been so integral to European history. Which is why today we'll be covering. Which is why today we'll be covering the revolutions of 1830, the revolutions of 1848, and the unification movements that happened in Europe through in the late 19th century. So that's what we'll be talking about today.
In this podcast, Revolve Europe. This is episode 1. Like we've been saying, we'll be talking about revolutions today in today's podcast. I'm Timothy Chen, and I'm joined by,
Advait and Timothy, and
and it will be a great one. So, 1820 revolutions. These were the first stretch of revolutions that happened, and this was mainly noted by Greece's, Russia's, and Spain's revolution. But the thing is, Greece differed from Russia and Spain. Greece focused on the Ottomans, but most importantly, Greece's independence. Because countries around Europe were having the Eastern question, where they were wondering what would happen to the areas with the Balkans since the Ottoman Empire was significantly declining over this time. And Greece, being one of those countries, they desired independence, and through their revolution, seeking their independence through different forms of nationalism, they were able to finally get that independence in the long run, showing it that it was a successful revolution because they were able to gain independence and the role of the Ottomans decreased.
not to mention, I think what was really important in this revolution specifically was the fact that Greece kind of had like the universal support of Europe, which is really rare to see throughout European history. But because the entirety of Europe loved Greece due to its like history with Europe, and also they hated Ottomans because well Christian superiority over Islam, they all basically teamed up on the side of Greece, supported it when they could, which ultimately is what I believe led it to actually being like a successful revolution rather than a failure.
Yeah, and that Europe support came in huge in this time. But another revolution that happened was the Russian Revolution. And this time it wasn't focused around nationalism, but rather liberalism. Because recently, the Tsar Alexander, well, recently back in the 1800s, obviously, but Tsar Alexander I just died, resulting in a huge power vacuum between all types of army officers and all types of those officials. And obviously, like any other official, they wanted more power and they wanted more prestige. So that led to some big revolts in the Decembrist revolt. And in Russia, after his death, the thing is, after him was Nicholas the First, which was his younger brother through the succession. And as a result, Nicholas was able to take control, and as a result, he was able to suppress the people that were trying to gain power. So as a result, Russia became more strictly controlled over these people, and it showed that even though that these people tried to fight through the liberalism paths, that revolution failed over there. And lastly, for Spain, that revolution was also massive. Because clearly there was a huge change in the dynamics of Spain. And Spain isn't really mentioned in the forefront of the 1900s, but this time was a huge revolution for Spain. Specifically, the people of Spain, they wanted more like power, they wanted like more reform. And although Ferdinand did originally want like more liberal ways and constitutions, he decided to just go back on his mind, and then boom, 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 he tore up the Constitution, and then everything went bad. And then as a result, these officers, like, they staged a revolt, and they got real mad. And they wanted constitutions and all of that. But the thing is, it failed, and, well, Ferdinand just secured even more control as a whole. But the thing is, overall, although there was some success, and although the king did capitulate and restore the constitution, the thing is, it wasn't for long, because Metternich comes in, and then it becomes bad again. So that's 1820, and those revolutions were massive because that showed a big stretch of new revolutions of how people wanted to come in and desire change throughout Europe. And this was massive as a stretch of new desires for change and reform, and these waves kept coming in throughout the 1800s and soon into the 1900s and the 2000s. That will also be further focused on in other episodes in the future. But
But
currently,
moving
we have to.
but moving on to like the direct effects of the 1820 revolutions, um, have the fact that they caused like a large wave of revolutions in the 1830s, and the 1830 revolutions really start with France, with the July Revolution, where the France king, and we see this trend a lot, where like one monarch tries to impose power on the subjects, but King Charles X sought to impose absolutism, which essentially was like really bad for the French people because like they did not want after the French Revolution they just threw in the late 18th century. They did not want a king to have absolute power because they know how bad it can get, which is why there was a radical revolt by the people, which forced him to abdicate. And Louis Philippe of another like high class but not like monarchy family from France took power and became known as the bourgeoisie king, because the bourgeoisie was essentially the class that was like running all these revolts because they weren't necessarily rich, but they had power, and they had power. They weren't, and they were like feeling the bad effects of like monarchs, and they were suffering a bit, but they still had enough like power in them to make change happen.
Yeah, the
Which is why you
bourgeoisie
have to
was
ask
great.
yourself, like, what essentially is the root cause of these revolutions in in the first place. So for France, it was definitely like the bourgeoisie and people wanting to rise up. But keep asking yourself that throughout this episode.
Yeah, these revolutions, we have to consider asking all of these forms of questions to make sure that we are being aware of like what is happening. Like we can't be unknown of what's happening during this entire time. But we have to look at some other revolutions in the 1830s as we go on. We'll look at Poland right now. Poland hasn't experienced the greatest of things throughout its history. Poland got bullied by the other countries. Poland later, after this time, got bullied by Russia, which was considered the USSR at the time. But Poland here, they tried to revolt with its students and its people, and well, because they were mad at the Russian government, right? So the Russian government, the thing is, Russia government does Russia government things, and they take over and they get mad, and then they abolish the Polish constitution as a result. And the Poles were killed. Poles were killed or exiled, injured, whatever. The Polish people just experienced terrible things because the Polish people rebelled. And honestly, you might want to ask yourself, like, how did like these governments be able to take back and force all these people to like stop rebelling? What are like different ways that people used like suppression tools or censorship tools throughout this time in the 1800s, but also in the future as we consider that.
So anyway, on to our last revolution of the 1830s, a big one right now, Belgium. So Belgium previously was merged with Holland, aka the Netherlands, but the Belgian people, especially the upper class, which we see again, the upper class taking power because they have like the means of it, but they didn't like rule by the Dutch, so they resisted it because they had a different language, religion, and like their culture was different, and we see like a pattern where like obviously the countries that are revolting have like differences in their daily life, which separates them like in an internal level from the people that overrule them. Which is why you have to ask yourself, why did people like the Belgians revolt and feel that their cultural differences were so important to their life that they could not be ruled by another nation? So anyway, yeah. The Belgians were actually successful at this revolution and successfully overthrew Dutch rule, eventually establishing a Belgian constitution and an independent Belgian state, which would remain for a significantly long time in European history.
Yeah, and this form of nationalism in Belgium did work. And unlike Poland, these Belgian people really fought for their rights and really eventually got their independence that they desired. Which possibly we might consider the fact that nationalism impacted so many forms of independence throughout Europe. But the 1830 revolutions weren't just all the revolutions as a whole, as we have to now focus on 1848, which was a year of massive revolutions. And while we might think that 12 months isn't a lot, 12 months was absolutely massive in Europe in 1848. Specifically, let's look at Italy in 1848 rather. Well, Italy did have its future unification that was successful later in time. Italy's revolution in 1848 didn't work as they wanted. As well, these nationalists they wanted change, and these liberalists wanted change, and they wanted to show their culture. However, they were unsuccessful in trying to gain control of the government and desire like these unifications that they wanted in the future. So it was pretty big how the Italy's 1848 revolution led to later unification, but right now there was failure, and as a result, the conservative victories happened. And although there were different people that wanted like liberal governments or change, and they didn't want Austrian control over Italy, this showed that Italy wasn't capable of successfully engaging in this revolt as a whole. But you might see this change in the future with the Italian unification.
But moving out of Italy for a second, we have our second major revolution in 1848, which was Austria-Hungary, and especially Hungary. Hungary is the key. Hungary is the key word because essentially, at this point in history, in the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire which has been ruling for like 250 years or even more at this point, was very vulnerable with a lot of revolutionary and nationalist movements coming throughout all the nations that they had control over, such as the Slavs, Czechs in Czech Republic, in modern day Czech Republic, Serbs, Croatians, Italians even, and especially Hungarians. Hungarians wanted this independence the most because, well, because in Hungary, like they were probably hit the hardest by Austria's policies, and they were like the second largest part or largest minority in the Austrian Empire, so they believed they deserved their own nations. So a lot of like the younger generation students and workers essentially started holding mass demonstrations across Austria-Hungary, which caused like the Austrian government to get scared, and the Hungarians then marched onto Vienna, but they were defeated because Austria, like the government, the Habsburgs, got help from Russia, and they were able to quash the revolution overall. However, that doesn't mean they won necessarily, because after that point, we see that Hungarian nationalism becomes like a increasing problem across Austria, and we see the entire weakening of the Austro-Hungarian empire throughout like all these minorities wanting their own independence, which is why you have to ask another question, which is how do these revolutions, even if they fail, lead to like overall long-lasting effects throughout Europe and throughout the nation specifically, and how do these revolutions cause further revolutions and events in the future?
Yeah, and well, nationalism obviously caused part of the Austrian Revolution. We'll have to see that Austria-Hungary was really demised because these minorities had significant forms of nationalist pride in themselves and big culture, and their hopes and dreams were never suppressed in the long run, as they always kept in mind of that nationalist pride. But another revolution to consider is also the German Revolution of 1848. And while we may consider that German unification happened in the future, this form of the German Revolution failed in its conditions. Specifically, the German people, well, they were mad at the current government, the German Confederation, in the 1848s. And considering that all these revolutions happened in the past, this sparked new desires for change and reform in the government as a whole to switch to a more liberal form of government. And the thing is, Germany was facing some tough times under its economic issues and all its other issues. But the priority right now is that Germany wants that change so they can focus as a whole on the better. Because in the past, they were simply the Holy Roman Empire, and now Germany was still in that shift state of the middle where they haven't gained full unification of the country. So their whole inspiration of like liberty and like, well, rather like liberal and a constitutional government. The thing is, they were failed in the long run because Frederick William IV, he gained the power, and as a result, conservatism came back into play for Germany, and this unification didn't work in this time. However, we might see, like similar to Italy, how this caused a change in revolution for the future unification of Germany.
And before we move on to the unification movements, I do want to mention there was one other somewhat important revolution in 1848, which was the French Revolution, because it was called the February Revolution, and again similar to the 1830 Revolution, the working class bourgeoisie and liberals were unhappy with the king that they instated, by the way, in 1830. They were unhappy with him, so he was forced to abdicate, which caused the Second French Republic this time. And then the new leader that they instated, Louis Blanc, like or they essentially advocated for more reform, and they advocated for more freedom for workers, especially because workers were causing this revolution. But but eventually But eventually, people were unhappy about a lot of events that were existing in the France at this moment. So it caused another revolution after the Second French Republic was formed, called the June Days Revolution, which closed a bunch of national workshops and marked the beginning of interclass warfare in France between the working class and the more upper class bourgeoisie people.
Yeah, we saw major change in France, like their additions of their Second Republic, but also universal male suffrage, which was pretty massive as not all men had the ability to vote during this time, simply because the rights weren't completely expansive to all the men, especially those in the lower classes. Now, focusing now to the newer unifications in the later of the 1800s, we have to first focus on German unification. German unification is pretty complicated, but yet we'll keep it dialed down to a pretty simple path. German unification obviously was caused by their anger in the past in the revolutions, and Frederick William, like I talked about earlier, the thing is, his control failed and was pretty much focused on Austria now in the terms of Germany. However, these German people had unification efforts and desired for their culture to be focused on a broader world class scale. So clearly, the German unification system was going to be huge in the changes of the dynamics of power in Europe. So we have to consider asking the question, how did unification change the balance of power in Europe? And also, how did different reactions to these unifications change how people reacted in their own country, specifically like minorities or other major culture groups during that time? But German unification was led under Otto von Bismarck, who was a realpolitik in itself, which focuses more on the people rather than specific parties, as he wanted to focus on unification straight up. And that's focused on unifying Germany under a single constitution, because previous revolutions weren't successful because they weren't able to create a German state or a constitution. And this was extremely massive during this time for Germany. So the thing is, German unification took place way after 1848, around 1870s during this time. But specifically, this involved the joining of German states into a single nation state, which was pretty big after the Franco-Prussian War. And German unification took many different steps. This took several wars, in fact, where the German people, as well as under Bismarck and other leaders, were trying to secure different parts of land from like Franco-Prussian War or Swedish Franco War, and whatever these wars specifically happened during this time was pretty big in the long run for German unification. And as a result, Germany was finally able to build its state, and its unification as a whole was also part of other unifications that happened during this time in the 1800s. As German unification, after their wins in the Franco-Prussian War and after the three other wars that happened during this time, with their securing of land just close to Denmark and areas near France, as well as areas near Prussia, they were able to unify under this state because of the successes that the leaders had put in place, desiring that the people should be valued more than the government or what they desired in their choices.
I want to mention this led to Otto von Bismarck implementing various policies that like more focused on the people, such as universal healthcare and other things, which like essentially show that yeah, revolution is for the people, not the governments. However, there was another major nation that also had unification movement in this time period, and that was Italy. Because in Italy, there was like a whole timeline of events, which started with like various Italian nation states after the original revolutions that happened in 1830 and 1848 were like super heavy on nationalism right now. They wanted to be a unified Italy. That movement was spreading all across Europe. There was like protests or like demonstrations all across Italy, and eventually what happened was Piedmont Sardinia, one of the major nation states in Italy at this time, under leadership of Count Camillo de Vore and King Victor Emmanuel, played a crucial role in the unification process because through a series of military campaigns where they went on and took over other Italian states, they essentially like became like a major power on the Italian peninsula, and like their main goal was to achieve unification through military conquest, because then if they they could unified all those states, then they could achieve the unification that everyone wanted. Um, and the most important figure under Piedmont Sardinia itself was a man named Giuseppe Garibaldi, because he was like the general who led all the military campaigns, and it's his he was the reason for the campaigns, especially in southern Italy and Sicily, to be like successful, which allowed Italian unification to spread further and allowed it to like actually be successful. It could be said that without Giuseppe Garibaldi, this man, then the unification movement would not have happened as a whole. That said,
Yeah,
even then, foreign powers like France and Britain supported Italy because they saw Italy as a way to counter against Austria, which is where we see the concert of Europe system take play in this whole thing. Which is where you have to ask yourself, how did foreign powers react to revolutionary and unification movements, and how did they use such movements as a way to leverage political power?
yeah, political power was pretty big through these leaders, and I just wanted to mention like how it was pretty cool that Garibaldi was able to unify all the South and then join up with Cavour and just straight up unite the entire country under the new emperor. But I think we can see like real similarities between Germany and Italy, specifically with their leader, where Cavour was a realpolitik similar to Bismarck. And well, that's pretty huge because realpolitik was massive during this time simply because the people wanted someone that could respect the people and have policies that are good and hoping for the betterment of the future.
But there is one major revolution that we didn't talk about today because it wasn't a physical revolution, but rather it was more like a revolution that took the entirety of Europe. The Industrial Revolution was probably the most important revolution that happened in the 19th century because it affected the entirety of Europe and it was actually the cause for many of these revolutions. For example, the Germans wished that they had like the technology that Britain had because Britain was like the first country that managed to industrialize. So they invented technology like trains, cars, or not cars, but trains, boats, steamboats, other transportation. They managed to like build ways to communicate with each other, which also essentially led to like the more globalization of Europe, and essentially Europe became more connected as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which allowed foreign nations, as I mentioned before, to easily like interact with other nations when it came to these revolutions, and which is why the Industrial Revolution played a huge part of the revolution process in Europe.
Yeah, we can talk about some specifics. Well, clearly there were two different industrial revolutions during this time. Well, obviously, the thing is, the first industrial revolution started before all these revolutions, like these 1820s. It started back in 1760, which was a huge moving factor in how people were able to use forms of violence or forms of military tool of some sort of lower technology to be able to go forth and do these things. But specifically, industrialization was absolutely huge because industrialization allowed for people to go with machinery and manufacturing. But the thing is, focusing on manufacturing, this allowed for energy production and transportation, which transportation was quickly developing, like countries in Britain or other ones. They focused on energy supply, like iron, coal, but also trade such as textiles. And these innovations allowed for quick development, but it also led to the development of middle classes and like the bourgeoisie, and as well as poorer classes. But the thing is, specifically, these middle classes and lower classes faced some struggles during this time. Like we can explain like how people had to go through things such as like workhouses or lower working conditions that didn't give as much right to these people, and as a result there was more health concern, such as issues like as cholera, and this resulted in reform desires in places like Britain in the long run, closer to the second industrial revolution that I'm talking about right now. And
And
well, yeah, you can go
and
on.
okay, yeah, and eventually after the Industrial Revolution, that was like essentially like the turning point for Europe because then they began developing and after like the unification of Germany and Italy, and they immediately began industrializing, and that's what like pushed Europe into the new era because well, the chain of revolutionary movements mostly stopped except for like Russia, which had a Bolshevik revolution, but that was for like more ideological reasons. So like we see that these revolutions, the Industrial Revolution as well as the unification movements and the pre 1850 revolutions, caused like Europe to become like more not just more nationalism, but like more countries were being represented. There was less monarchies. There was less people taking control of one another, which allowed Europe to function more on a grand scale. For example, let's bring the Berlin Conference into this because countries that had just recently gained revolutions or gained independence, such as Belgium, such as Germany, such as Italy, were able to immediately get power on like the European scale, which is what allowed them to demand territory in Africa, which is why Belgium got like a huge chunk out of it, which is why Germany and Italy got territories, which and it kind of diversified like the European power landscape, and also was a result what resulted in this like end of the concert of Europe, all these new nations gaining power so quickly after gaining independence.
Yeah, European power, especially with imperialism, we saw a massive rise and like just rises of desires for imperialism after these revolutions. And like the Berlin Conference, it showed how European power was continuing to rise and how these changes from revolutions focused less on religion like it did back in the 1400s and 1300s, and rather now it focused on manufacturing technology development, but also control and liberal constitutions as well as constitutional governments that really gave people more right rather than an absolute monarchy, which was completely dominant in these earlier years.
But sadly, as we move on, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the 20th century here, because as we move on, these revolutions, while they were good with getting rid of monarchy and spreading I- ideas and nationalism, all these new powers in Europe is what actually led to World War II. Or World War One, as we see with a unified Italy, a unified Germany, making France and Britain, the previously established powers, really scared. That's what caused like a chain of alliances. That's what caused countries to side with one over the other, and that's eventually what caused World War One to like be so important and spread on a national scale, because countries with their territories and with like being so spread out just had to get involved really quickly, had to deal with like fighting on various different fronts. And yeah, so while yes, these revolutions were good for those time periods, they did have a lot of negative consequences, which is why you have to ask an integrally important question, which is how does countries that gaining independence lead to like more political tension in the future, and how do newly formed countries add to like the political landscape political landscape of continent or even the entire world, considering Europe's influence.
Yeah, that question is great. As we can see that tension was rising. As I just wanted to really quickly talk about how tension was pretty big and just had a huge influence, especially in the industrial revolutions. As we saw rises like trade unions, where people desired to fight for reform and fight for living, better rights, better reform for these lower class people. And well, that clearly displays how people back then in the industrial revolution had also a form of fighting power similar to those in like nationalist revolutions or those in liberalist revolutions, where they wanted more rights and they wanted more consideration, not just the rich people getting focused. And that led to revolutions or somewhat similar ideological movements like communism, where Karl Marx really dominated the spectrum over there when it comes to those movements, and how tensions led to different changes and new ideas that resulted. So that makes me want to ask, well, makes me want to ask a question that you want to consider, is that how did these tensions lead to new ideas or change during this time, and how 1800 revolutions might have been impacting the future and how people consider how development or structure of governments or work goes.
So yeah, so like to end off today, I just want to talk because we've been talking for like the past 30 minutes about all these revolutions in Europe, but um revolutions as a whole are just like really important to European and even world history as a whole, because revolutions essentially allow other or allow people to like form their own governments, not like get oppressed by one another, like create governments that are more fit for them. And they're essentially so common because like oftentimes like having one sole power over like a large group of people never works out, because eventually you're just not going to be able to take care of all those individual groups of people. So even like afterwards, like in the 20th century, we see countries revolting from like European nations themselves, like their colonies have revolted, like Vietnam, India, Algeria. So we see that revolutions have played such a key part of European history, which is why I think I'm gonna ask you the final question of today, which is like, what impact or what impact does revolution have and the ability to revolt, or how does the ability to revolt affect the lives of citizens? And yeah,
Yeah, how like different forms of revolutions, whether that be like more aggressive revolutions such as those in Algeria or those in Vietnam, or those of like less smaller types of revolutions where it didn't involve as much violence like India. So you want to consider how did different outside effects or factors like influence how people revolted or showed a change in idea that they wanted to show to their European metropoles in their countries.
so with that said, I hope this has been a, I hope that this has been a great episode of Revolve Europe, where we talked all about the revolutions that happened in Europe throughout the 1830s and 1848 and the unification movements that happened at the late 19th century, and how overall that just affected European history, and why this part of European history that we talked about today is so integral to the whole entire like story of Europe. So, with that said, this has been a great time. I'm your co-host Advait and
And I'm your other co-host Timothy Chen. Thank you for listening to our first episode of Revolve Europe. We hope to release future episodes, possibly with the same co-hosts and possibly some new guests. But that's it for episode 1, Revolve Europe, focusing on the revolutions in the early times of the 1800s, as well as their impacts causing future revolutions later in the 1800s, as well as the 1900s. And that's it. Thank you.
bye.